Welcome to this week's discussion. My location that I chose to talk about is properly called from this time period Fort St. Mark, but the more appropriate name that most people would recognize would be the Castillo de San Marcos, located in St. Augustine, Florida. Now, to start with, most people would not think of Florida as being part of the American Revolution, as most of everything that gets studied of the war itself does take place in what we would call the 13 colonies. But as some historians will put it, East Florida, because there was a West Florida, is known as the 14th colony. During the Spanish time, this structure will be known as the Castillo de San Marcos, pictured there on the left. It was originally built to help establish the Spanish colony in Florida and to protect the small town that grew up next to it. There was fear that Europeans that were settling in the area, namely the French, up in what it would now be known as Jacksonville, may push down into this region, and there was also fear of pirates. And that is why the fort itself is right on a waterway with an entrance out to the Atlantic Ocean and part of the waterways that also extend southward out to the ocean. Now, the Spanish are forced to give up the colony of Florida after the 7-Year War, or the French and Indian War, depending on which perspective that we want to look at. Regardless of how you look at it, it's no longer Spanish, and this is when we call it Fort St. Mark's. Now, we know that it was held from 1763 on, but major renovations seem to have taken place in 1775-1776 time period. There is not a lot of sources out there, which was kind of surprising, but two of the books that I did come across, one was written by a gentleman named Barrs, who basically says that St. Augustine became a haven for loyalists in the South looking to relocate and move. And as St. Augustine was only one of two towns that had a potential for them to move, and that as many of them moved into this region, the British themselves began rebuilding. Now, Pennington, more recent author, does delve deeper into this rebuild and actually points out that many of those that did the rebuilding of it and that were relocating were actually from Virginia, and they were loyal subjects, which does match what Barrs was saying. But he discusses how the garrison was filled with chiefly foreign recruits. Now, from the National Park Service, we do know that the fort itself was used to garrison troops. Many of those troops were being used to be deployed into the Southern Theater, and they thought that Florida was a good place to get them acclimated to the weather, which does make sense. It was also a strong location to help store weapons and to anchor their control of East Florida, especially out of concern that the Spanish who were in New Orleans might begin pushing, which they do later in the war, and they do reconquer Western Florida, but they're never able to actually push all the way over. Now, the most recent book, written by Kotlik, actually talks about how it was the central command post for many of these southern operations and a staging ground for raids up into Georgia and backcountry regions. Now, to help go along with those raids into Georgia, one of the things I would like to point out in the picture, if you notice the gentleman in the green uniforms generally referenced Rangers, and there was, ironically, a group of Rangers here that did work out of the Castillo de San Marcos, the East Florida Rangers, but they answered to the governor, not the British. So there was a difficulty in command, control, what they were doing. I did find it unique and interesting that many of the operations these Rangers ran were to help attack and drive cattle out of Georgia back. Now, the big thing that this fort is going to be used for is a prison. One of the most famous prisoners held here is Gadsden. He was captured in Charleston after the fighting. As we know, Gadsden is credited with helping create or creating, depending on who you ask, the flag pictured there on the right. He then gets rearrested and then claims that it is a violation of his parole, and he is brought down to St. Augustine, where he is offered basically to be paroled if he joins the British. He refuses, and they then put him in confinement for 41 or 42 weeks. It's a little debate on which of the two it ends up being. Very harsh treatment, starvation, even to the point of daily being threatened with hanging in response to the Major Andre hanging. Other important individuals, we have Thomas Hayward, Arthur Middleton, and Edward Rutfield, 3 signers of the Declaration of Independence that was also held in this fort. Now, I did find it ironic that Kortlandt did mention that the fort itself was actually used as a prison for French and colonists, and that the French could get paroled and then they could buy quarters with families in St. Augustine. So your higher ranking officers tended to stay with the richer folks within the city. Now, at the end of the war, 1783, the fort is returned to the Spanish, but it wasn't part of the Treaty of Paris. There was a separate treaty signed with the Spanish that gave them the fort back in exchange for giving the British the Bahamas. Eventually, Florida does become part of the United States, and at that point, it becomes known as Fort Marion in honor of Francis Marion. Now, the fort itself, I feel it would be a great value as a location to go to, mostly because, and I have to give this credit to my wife, who told me a long time ago that history is about a bunch of dead people and who cares about it. But yet the first time she went to a place that you physically can look at, walk through, and touch, and I asked her, how do you like this? She goes, well, this is great. And I remind her, this is history. She goes, no, this is actually something I can feel and engage. For the Castillo de San Marcos, or whichever name we choose to name it, you can go, you can interact, you can see actual gun firings, and they're working on restoring it. Early 1900s is when it becomes a national park, and so it is preserved to even a greater extent. As for other value with it, you also have Fort Moses, which is just north, which does not tie into the American Revolution, but is the first legally sanctioned black settlement in the United States that does actually get taken down by the British. And you have Fort Matanzas, which is another Spanish fort that helped work with the Castillo de San Marcos as a location that you can work from. Thank you.